Part 1. My parents want to take my house and give it to my golden brother, even though they kick me out of their house, saying there's no space for me. I'm warning you right away that this story is going to be insanely long, so long that it won't even fit into an hour. But don't worry, it's divided into several parts, namely 9, and you don't have to listen to the whole thing right away from start to finish. For your convenience, I've added timestamps to this video. Let's get started. To be honest, I don't really care whether you believe this or not, because this whole story is just madness. I don't blame those who call it all nonsense. I might not have believed it myself, so I won't argue with you. I don't care if someone from my family sees this, I'm not going to sugarcoat anything, but I won't reveal details that could expose my identity. I'm just over 30, not married, and I have a brother who is 29 years old and already has 4 kids. His first kid was born when he was 22, the second one a year later, the third one 2 years after the second, and the fourth was born just a couple of months ago. I don't get along well with his wife because she always acts arrogantly and tries to provoke me. If I react in any way, she immediately turns into a victim, crying on the spot and even putting on a whole show to get sympathy. My parents and brother absolutely adore her, even though they know what she's really like. But they just don't care. I'll admit, she is a very beautiful woman, but she is so repulsive that I could never feel attracted to her. Moreover, she refuses to work, even though she has a higher education. My mother, by the way, happily helps her with the kids all day long, so the financial situation of their large family entirely depends on my brother. This also means that they can't afford to live anywhere except for my parents' house, and they have problems with personal space too, considering that 4 kids and 4 adults live under one roof in a 3-room house built in the 1960s. In childhood, my younger brother was clearly the favorite. There's a 3-year age difference between us, but he developed a superiority complex because I was severely punished if I reacted in any way to his pranks. It was obvious that my parents cared much more about him because he got everything, unless other people started criticizing my parents about it, which happened quite often. From other family members, this is exactly why we moved about 240 kilometers away from the rest of the relatives. So, we usually only saw them on holidays because the drive took 3 hours. My brother used physical force against me several times, flirted with my first girlfriend, which caused her to break up with me, and laughed at any of my failures. My parents just told me to ignore it when I got upset. I was only treated equally when my parents wanted to keep up appearances. I admit, it was pretty funny to watch their faces when they had to treat me equally to my brother on birthdays and Christmas, because during the holidays, other relatives were around who loved to meddle in others' affairs and gossip. So my parents tried to hide what was really going on in our family. They even threatened to take away all my belongings if I ever opened my mouth. When I turned 18, my parents threw a real party because I moved out. Now they didn't have to support me anymore. I hadn't even finished school when I left home, but living on other people's couches was way better than living with my parents. Since then, I've kept minimal communication with them. They didn't even come to my graduation, but I didn't care. Since then, I only saw my parents and brother on holidays, when other family members were around. The start of the pandemic in 2020 was a tough time for me. I lost my job and couldn't extend my apartment lease. My roommate also lost his job, and we couldn't afford to live there on unemployment benefits. It was a 2-bedroom apartment that I really liked. When the lease was coming to an end, my roommate left earlier to go back to his relatives, and I had to sell almost all my things because I was about to become homeless. In fact, I shouldn't have rented such an expensive place, but I liked living large until life taught me a lesson. I realized I should have lived in a cheaper place to save money for the future, but I had a plan. I had a pickup truck, and I bought a camper for $1,000 in good condition, which I installed on my pickup to live in for a while. This was supposed to be a temporary solution, but in the end, I lived there much longer than I had originally planned. I hoped to live in the camper on my parents' property, where my brother's family also lived. But when I asked my parents if I could stay there for a while, they said they already had a full house and didn't want to see me. Plus, we hadn't gotten along well for the last 10 years. They said they would agree if I paid them the amount equivalent to rent in their neighborhood. That was way too much just to park my pickup on their property. I was unemployed and trying to save as much money as possible while receiving unemployment benefits until I could find a new job. I could have rented an apartment for the same amount they were asking. My parents called my camper an eyesore and told me to leave since we couldn't come to an agreement about the payment. My sister-in-law thought it was just hilarious that I had to live in a camper. My brother joined her, pointing at me and calling me a homeless drifter. The first night, I parked my pickup in a store parking lot. I was scared out of my mind, thinking someone might try to break in. Needless to say, I didn't sleep very well that night. I had nowhere else to go because other relatives with houses and property lived pretty far away, and all my friends lived in apartments. Plus, I was very attached to my neighborhood, so I didn't want to leave. I also redirected my mail there. It was the only way to keep getting my letters. Finding a permanent place to park was pretty hard. I was looking for a job similar to the one I had before, but months passed, and during that time, I had to deal with a lot of shit. I ran into beggars and drug addicts. People demanded that I leave because my camper ruined their view. At one point, a man who said he was a representative of the HOA demanded that I leave, even though I wasn't parked anywhere near the apartment buildings. When I asked which HOA, the man became very aggressive and started threatening me, so I left anyway to avoid trouble. Additionally, I adapted to using an extension cord to plug into random buildings when I parked on the street. I know that wasn't great, but I needed to keep the fridge cold. I had a small solar panel for charging my phone, but I didn't have a generator because generators are noisy and require fuel. So, I survived as best as I could. After many months of this life, I finally found a job. I had to move to a neighboring city for a job that wasn't in retail. I had worked in that field during college and promised myself I would never return. To be honest, I had almost broken that promise several times. I was still receiving unemployment benefits, but I didn't have a place to live, and I was just plain bored. I had nothing to do except read, watch movies on a small portable DVD player, use my phone, or laptop. I was constantly writing down where I could park and which public restrooms I could use. I even envied the Japanese for their public baths. We could really use something like that. When I finally found a new job, I almost started living there. There were old employee parking spots that no one used because they were far from the building. My boss, the company owner, even liked the arrangement that I would live in this parking lot because I was willing to take any shift. He even allowed me to take the camper off the truck and park it in one of the spots so I could drive without it. I'm not sure if this was legal, but no one said anything. I was always available when work needed help, and I worked almost every day of the week. My boss allowed me to plug the camper into the building's electricity and water supply, and in return, I worked for free on Sundays when the office was empty except for the janitor and the security guard. In childhood, my younger brother was clearly the favorite. There's a 3-year age difference between us, but he developed a superiority complex because I was severely punished if I reacted in any way to his pranks. It was obvious that my parents cared much more about him because he got everything, unless other people started criticizing my parents about it, which happened quite often. From other family members, this is exactly why we moved about 240 kilometers away from the rest of the relatives. So, we usually only saw them on holidays because the drive took 3 hours. My brother used physical force against me several times, flirted with my first girlfriend, which caused her to break up with me, and laughed at any of my failures. My parents just told me to ignore it when I got upset. I was only treated equally when my parents wanted to keep up appearances. I admit, it was pretty funny to watch their faces when they had to treat me equally to my brother on birthdays and Christmas, because during the holidays, other relatives were around who loved to meddle in others' affairs and gossip. So my parents tried to hide what was really going on in our family. They even threatened to take away all my belongings if I ever opened my mouth. When I turned 18, my parents threw a real party because I moved out. Now they didn't have to support me anymore. I hadn't even finished school when I left home, but living on other people's couches was way better than living with my parents. Since then, I've kept minimal communication with them. They didn't even come to my graduation, but I didn't care. Since then, I only saw my parents and brother on holidays, when other family members were around. The start of the pandemic in 2020 was a tough time for me. I lost my job and couldn't extend my apartment lease. My roommate also lost his job, and we couldn't afford to live there on unemployment benefits. It was a 2-bedroom apartment that I really liked. When the lease was coming to an end, my roommate left earlier to go back to his relatives, and I had to sell almost all my things because I was about to become homeless. In fact, I shouldn't have rented such an expensive place, but I liked living large until life taught me a lesson. I realized I should have lived in a cheaper place to save money for the future, but I had a plan. I had a pickup truck, and I bought a camper for $1,000 in good condition, which I installed on my pickup to live in for a while. This was supposed to be a temporary solution, but in the end, I lived there much longer than I had originally planned. I hoped to live in the camper on my parents' property, where my brother's family also lived. But when I asked my parents if I could stay there for a while, they said they already had a full house and didn't want to see me. Plus, we hadn't gotten along well for the last 10 years. They said they would agree if I paid them the amount equivalent to rent in their neighborhood. That was way too much just to park my pickup on their property. I was unemployed and trying to save as much money as possible while receiving unemployment benefits until I could find a new job. I could have rented an apartment for the same amount they were asking. My parents called my camper an eyesore and told me to leave since we couldn't come to an agreement about the payment. My sister-in-law thought it was just hilarious that I had to live in a camper. My brother joined her, pointing at me and calling me a homeless drifter. The first night, I parked my pickup in a store parking lot. I was scared out of my mind, thinking someone might try to break in. Needless to say, I didn't sleep very well that night. I had nowhere else to go because other relatives with houses and property lived pretty far away, and all my friends lived in apartments. Plus, I was very attached to my neighborhood, so I didn't want to leave. I also redirected my mail there. It was the only way to keep getting my letters. Finding a permanent place to park was pretty hard. I was looking for a job similar to the one I had before, but months passed, and during that time, I had to deal with a lot of shit. I ran into beggars and drug addicts. People demanded that I leave because my camper ruined their view. At one point, a man who said he was a representative of the HOA demanded that I leave, even though I wasn't parked anywhere near the apartment buildings. When I asked which HOA, the man became very aggressive and started threatening me, so I left anyway to avoid trouble. Additionally, I adapted to using an extension cord to plug into random buildings when I parked on the street. I know that wasn't great, but I needed to keep the fridge cold. I had a small solar panel for charging my phone, but I didn't have a generator because generators are noisy and require fuel. So, I survived as best as I could. After many months of this life, I finally found a job. I had to move to a neighboring city for a job that wasn't in retail. I had worked in that field during college and promised myself I would never return. To be honest, I had almost broken that promise several times. I was still receiving unemployment benefits, but I didn't have a place to live, and I was just plain bored. I had nothing to do except read, watch movies on a small portable DVD player, use my phone, or laptop. I was constantly writing down where I could park and which public restrooms I could use. I even envied the Japanese for their public baths. We could really use something like that. When I finally found a new job, I almost started living there. There were old employee parking spots that no one used because they were far from the building. My boss, the company owner, even liked the arrangement that I would live in this parking lot because I was willing to take any shift. He even allowed me to take the camper off the truck and park it in one of the spots so I could drive without it. I'm not sure if this was legal, but no one said anything. I was always available when work needed help, and I worked almost every day of the week. My boss allowed me to plug the camper into the building's electricity and water supply, and in return, I worked for free on Sundays when the office was empty except for the janitor and the security guard. Winter was easy with a small electric heater, but summer was unbearable. So, I bought a used mobile air conditioner to at least cool down a little. I earned a lot of money by working overtime and learned a lot from other employees. In the middle of this year, I managed to get a promotion at the company, became the manager, and started earning well. That's when I decided I wanted to buy a house. The fear I experienced when I couldn't pay for my rented apartment made me realize that I needed something stable in my life for the long term. I started looking for a house and found a one-story house with 3 bedrooms and a small plot of land, just 3 kilometers from my work. I even managed to bring the price down by $10,000. I spent almost all my savings on the down payment and got approval for a mortgage. Finally, I didn't have to live in a camper anymore. I had enough space on the property to park my pickup behind the house and take down the camper. I did this just in case I ever wanted to use it again. When I fully settled into the house, I made the mistake of boasting about my achievement on social media. My family saw the post, and that's when everything started. A few weeks later, my parents, brother, and his wife came to visit me without warning to take a tour of my house. I didn't even give them my address, so I still don't know how they found out where I live. None of my friends confessed, and none of my relatives had visited me before. So, I suspect they may have followed me from work to my home, which wouldn't surprise me. As soon as I opened the door, my parents and my brother's family literally barged in like loud tourists. They started acting like they owned the place, walking around inspecting everything. My sister-in-law, with a creepy smile on her face, kept giving me side glances, and only later did I realize why this made me angrier than a bull on steroids stung by a wasp. My parents kept talking about how much space I had now and that it was too much for such a lonely guy with no wife and kids. Not now, but probably someday, they added. And my brother kept repeating that I had more space than in our parents' house and that my house was closer to his work. Eventually, my brother asked to talk to me alone. Everyone else suddenly went out onto the terrace. It was at that moment that I finally realized they were up to something. My brother, let's call him Dan, said the house was too big for me alone and that I should let him and his family move in because his wife was pregnant with their 4th child, and my house was closer to his work. He pointed out that I already had a camper, so I could just live in it on the property while they would live in my house. I want to note that Dan didn't even mention paying me rent. Keep in mind that he has a good job. He also started talking about how there would be rules for me and even a curfew, and that I wouldn't be able to just enter the house anytime without prior notice. If this weren't my brother, I'd think this person had lost his mind, but Dan had long lost his sanity thanks to our parents, who treated him like he was the center of the universe. I tried to argue with him, but he kept interrupting me as if I had no right to speak. I didn't want to give him the house, or even rent part of it to anyone, maybe to make paying the mortgage easier, but certainly not to him and his arrogant wife. I've read a lot of stories like this online, but I never thought I'd become the main character in one. But my parents, brother, and sister-in-law really fit the description of narcissistic, self-absorbed psychopaths. So, I took out my phone and started recording. Dan didn't even notice and kept waving his hands, listing all the reasons why my house was more important to him. Then he went from words to action and tried to shake my hand, as if everything had already been decided. That's when I finally stood my ground and said no, and I said it so loudly that Dan took a step back. I rarely raised my voice at him because my parents punished me for it. But this was my house, not theirs. Here, I could be firm. I stood up and told him that my house wasn't for rent and that what he thought he could move in just because our parents wanted him to didn't mean anything to me. I bought this house for myself, and it's not my fault that he keeps having kids and has to live with our parents because he can't afford to move out. Dan came up to me as close as possible without touching me and said that I didn't deserve this house and that he needed better housing for his family. I laughed in his face and said that was complete nonsense because I worked hard to buy this house. Of course, I deserve it. Dan started yelling that I had no wife and kids, so I didn't need all this space, so I could let him live there. I said I wasn't going to let him have anything. I already mentioned that he didn't even offer to pay rent. If I let him move in, I'd still have to pay the mortgage on my own house. Dan then came up with an airtight argument, saying he didn't need to pay anything because we were family, and our parents said I should give him my house. I shouted, as if their word is law, and then said that they had no right or authority to decide what happens with my house. And just like that, my parents and sister-in-law barged back into the house and surrounded me, trying to force me to agree. There was a lot of shouting, but to summarize, from this point on, I heard the phrase, "Do this for Dan," over and over again. During the argument, I told them all that they had no right to interfere in my life and demanded that they leave, or I'd call the police. My sister-in-law screamed at me, saying she was pregnant and I couldn't treat her like this. I told her I hadn't given her any reason to think she could take anything from me, like I'd just let her. I added that I wasn't obligated to take care of her or her family. Then I called her an arrogant bitch who had never respected me and said I didn't care how many kids she had. She wasn't going to live in my house. These words made her so angry that she charged at me. She landed a good punch to my face and tried to hit me again, but my brother held her back. Despite her screaming and demanding to be let go so she could scratch my eyes out, I kept my phone in my hand, recording everything. I raised it, warning that I would call the police if they didn't leave. Slowly, my parents told Dan that they were leaving and began heading out. Then my mother said that I had 1 week to reconsider. I replied that I would never reconsider. After that, I turned to my sister-in-law and told her that I had a video recording of everything that had happened, and if she tried anything, I would file a police report for assault. She screamed, ran out of the house crying, and covered her face with her hands. The last one to leave was my mother, who once again said I had to do this for Dan, and I replied that it would never happen. The next few days were tense. My parents tried to call me, leaving voicemail after voicemail, but I didn't pick up. They only tried to reach me through texts and messages, but I ignored them. They couldn't understand that I wasn't going to give in to their pressure. I knew my brother would be furious, but he had no right to expect anything from me, especially after all that had happened. I thought that maybe, just maybe, they would eventually back off, but they didn't. A week passed, and I was still firm in my decision. I kept to myself, focusing on work, and didn't respond to any more attempts from my family to reach out. But it was getting harder to ignore the reality that this wasn't over. I knew my parents would never stop trying to convince me to give in. I just couldn't let them take my house, especially when they had treated me so poorly for so many years. One evening, just as I was about to relax after a long day at work, I received a message from my mother. It was short, just a few lines, but it struck me hard. She said that if I didn't let my brother move into my house, I would be responsible for destroying the family. She told me how much it meant to Dan and his family to have a place where they could finally be comfortable. She added that if I really loved them, I would make the sacrifice for the sake of family. I could feel my blood boiling as I read her words. How could they not understand? How could they think that I should just give up everything for them after how they had treated me all these years? I didn't respond. I couldn't. There was nothing left to say. I had made my decision, and no amount of guilt or manipulation was going to change it. But I knew this wasn't the end of it. They wouldn't let go so easily. They would keep trying. They would keep making me feel like I was the one in the wrong, but I wasn't going to let them. I couldn't. The following week, my brother Dan tried to call me several times. Each time, I ignored his calls, but I knew he wouldn't give up that easily. I couldn't help but feel a mix of anger and frustration. It was clear that they were not going to accept my decision. I was starting to realize that my family was never going to respect my boundaries. They always expected me to give in, to sacrifice my own well-being for their comfort. And for the first time, I wasn't going to do that. A few days later, I received a text from my father. It was blunt and to the point. He said that they were coming over to talk. I knew exactly what that meant. They wanted to try again to convince me to let Dan and his family move in. This time, however, I was ready. I wasn't going to let them walk all over me anymore. They arrived unannounced, just like before. My parents and brother barged into my house, acting like they owned the place. I stood there, watching them walk through my door without any respect for my space or my wishes. My mother immediately started talking about how much Dan needed this house and how it would be such a blessing for his growing family. My brother, of course, jumped in with his usual attitude, pointing out that I had too much space for myself. He said that if I cared about family, I would let them live here. I stayed silent at first, letting them talk, but inside, I was seething. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I looked Dan in the eye and said, "You're not moving in here. This house is mine, and I'm not giving it to you or anyone else." The room went quiet. My mother's face fell, and my father stared at me as if I had betrayed them. But I wasn't going to back down. I told them again that this was my house, and they had no right to demand anything from me. It didn't matter that they were family. They couldn't just take what I had worked so hard for. My brother looked furious. He started shouting, saying that I was being selfish and that I was breaking up the family. He tried to guilt-trip me, saying that if I really loved them, I would help them out. But I didn't want to hear it anymore. "I love you, but that doesn't mean I have to give up everything for you," I told him. "This is my life. I don't owe you anything." After that confrontation, things between us got worse. My family tried to make me feel guilty for not letting Dan and his family live in my house, but I stood firm in my decision. They started to cut me off from family events, and I knew that they were talking behind my back, telling everyone how horrible I was for not giving them what they wanted. But I didn't care anymore. It hurt, of course. It hurt to see how easily my family turned on me just because I refused to give in to their demands. But I knew that this was the right thing to do. I had worked hard to get where I was, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it away from me. In the end, I learned that standing up for myself wasn't easy, especially when it meant going against my family. But it was necessary. I wasn't going to let anyone walk all over me again. And now, I have the peace of knowing that I made the right choice, even if it cost me some relationships. Part 2. About how my parents tried to take my house for my brother. They broke the locks while I wasn't home. Take my house for my brother. They broke the locks while I wasn't home. Yes, I understand that there are already similar stories on the internet. I've seen many of them, but that doesn't mean someone can monopolize the right to such events in their life. Anyway, I don't blame those who think my case is nonsense. I'd probably think the same if I were in their place. However, you must have already realized how spoiled my parents are because they are the source of all my problems in life and made my brother the idiot he is today. They never gave me a clear explanation of why, and I fear that there simply isn't one. Some people can't explain why they choose a favorite child. Apparently, all that's left for them is to continue supporting the child they've chosen as their favorite. That's exactly what my parents tried to do. I practically ruined their lives because of this, not legally, but emotionally. After I kicked my parents, brother, and sister-in-law out, I immediately went to social media and posted to tell all our relatives what happened. I laid our conflict out for everyone to see because I knew the first thing my parents would do when they got home was try to flip the situation and paint me as the villain. And I was absolutely right. But I had about an hour to act before they did, and I had video evidence confirming my version of events. My strategy worked because I immediately received support from some relatives. My parents, brother, and sister-in-law were probably already planning to write their version, but it was too late. So, they didn't even try to lie too much. My parents, Dan, and my sister-in-law had a few supporters among the relatives, but not many. Most people already knew what they were like, so they understood quickly. One person called me. I don't know who it was, but they were shouting at me, saying I was a terrible brother and that I needed to give way to the real family. Then they hung up and blocked my number. They never called again. A week later, my parents showed up again, with Dan at my doorstep, just as they had promised in their ultimatum. They were ringing the doorbell and banging on the door like crazy until I finally opened it. I only opened the door a little, and they tried to break in, but I had installed a couple of chains that stopped them, and I even pressed my body against the door for extra assurance. My father and brother demanded that I let them in, but I told them I was recording everything on camera and would call the police if they tried to break in again. My mother calmed them down and then, in her sickly sweet manner, asked if I was ready to let my brother move in. I told her and the rest of them to go away and never come back. My mother immediately started fake crying and asked why I couldn't do this for Dan since he was my favorite brother. I laughed and told her directly that I didn't love him because he had treated me like garbage for years, and they had only encouraged it. They were terrible parents, and he was a terrible brother. Then I told them to leave, or I would call the police immediately. They all left surprisingly easily, except for my mother's loud sobbing and the angry looks the others threw at me. Some might say that making them leave was suspiciously easy, but I thought this whole story was over. However, I think I should have taken the situation more seriously because they had other dumb plans. On Friday evening, when I came home, I saw a moving pickup truck and my brother's minivan parked in front of my house. It was Dan with his family, moving their things. When he saw me, he just waved with a stupid grin on his face. I was furious and told him and the others to stop, but my sister-in-law smugly told me that whether I liked it or not, they were moving in. Then, with the fakest tone ever, she tilted her head and puffed out her lips, saying that my mommy had allowed them to move in and that I should always listen to my mommy. I was seething with rage hearing those words and seeing her smug expression. So, I locked myself in my pickup truck and immediately called the police. When they realized what I was doing, my sister-in-law started banging on my window, yelling for me to stop, claiming I couldn't treat her like this because she and Dan needed the house. She screamed, "Why can't you do this for Dan?" I replied, "Go to hell. This is my fucking house, not his." Then she threatened to scratch my pickup if I didn't stop calling the police. The 911 operator heard everything since the window of the pickup was slightly open. I told my sister-in-law that if she damaged my pickup, I would sue her. She was smart enough to back off. When the police arrived, Dan and his family had locked themselves in my house. I told the officers what had happened and showed them my driver's license with my current address. When we reached my front door, I saw that they had changed the locks. The old lock was lying on the porch with the core broken out, and a drill was lying nearby that they had used. Could they be any dumber, leaving evidence right in front of me? I pointed out the broken lock and the drill, then gave the police a brief report on all the previous events. Dan probably called our parents after I got home because they arrived while I was talking to the police. My parents immediately started lying, claiming that I had agreed to rent my house to my brother and his family. I told them it was a lie, and I could prove it. Then, Dan and his sister-in-law finally came out of my house with some papers in their hands. They looked extremely smug, as though they had somehow outsmarted me. It turned out they had actually made and printed a fake rental agreement, but my signature wasn't on it. There was a signature, but it was clearly not mine. I don't think any of them had ever seen my signature before, so it was incredibly stupid on their part. I told my parents and Dan that this was outright fraud and that if the police investigated, they would easily figure it out. I also noted that any legal action would probably not help them, and Dan might even lose his job, which would leave his family without their only source of income. I also added that I would hire a lawyer and sue for damages if anything from my property was stolen or damaged, and I would call child services for good measure. Dan turned pale and looked genuinely scared when he heard all this, but my mother stepped between us and started insisting again that I should do this for Dan and live in the fucking camper so they could finally live in the house. I screamed at her that if she thought it was such a good idea, then she should do it for Dan and give him her house. The police stepped away from me, and I told them I wanted everyone to leave immediately, or I would press charges. I loudly declared that they had broken into my house by changing the locks, forged documents, and that I had video evidence of my sister-in-law's assault on me. These were crimes that could ruin their lives if I wanted, and if they didn't leave, that's exactly what I would do. The only reason I hadn't done it yet was because of Dan's kids. When my parents heard this, it seemed like they finally realized that they couldn't force me to do anything for Dan. My mother gave up and said she would end all of this. Then she went over to my sister-in-law and had a quiet conversation with her, while my father talked to Dan. My sister-in-law immediately started crying loudly and tearing up the fake rental agreement into small pieces, scattering them like confetti. The police officer told her to pick up the paper, or she would be fined for littering. Dan had to tell his kids to take the things back to the truck. The kids cried, and the oldest son was literally sobbing because he wouldn't get his own room. My sister-in-law and Dan gathered their kids and made one last pathetic attempt to guilt-trip me, setting up a scene of an unhappy family. You know, like in the movies when everyone gathers in a group hug, looking in the same direction. I'm sure they rehearsed it all. All the kids were looking at me with pleading eyes and trembling lips. My sister-in-law kept stroking her pregnant belly and tilting her head, trying to look like a sad puppy, and my brother made the saddest face he could and said, "Please don't do this. We need to live here." But I didn't budge and told them to keep packing. All the kids and my sister-in-law started crying even louder, and Dan yelled at me, "Are you happy now? You refused us a home because you're too selfish to share and help your family." I started laughing like a madman and replied, he didn't want to share. He wanted to take it. And no tears are going to make me let his family move in because he's no longer my brother. He's just a self-centered jerk who thinks he can take whatever he wants like he did when we were kids. Dan started throwing insults at me, and until the police told him to calm down, or he would end up in handcuffs, he kept shouting. He puckered his lips and looked both ridiculous and incredibly furious. I asked the police to stay until my parents, brother, and sister-in-law left. They said they weren't going anywhere until it was all over. In fact, a few minutes later, instead of 2 officers, there were 4, as 2 more arrived for some reason. This gave my parents an extra push to hurry up. I made Dan give me the keys to the new lock he had put on my front door, although the next day, I changed the lock anyway because I didn't know if they had copies of the keys. He reluctantly handed them over, but instead of giving them to me, he threw them on the ground in the storm drain, saying I should get them myself. But one of the officers scolded him and made him take the keys out. He had to remove the grate and got pretty dirty in the process. When he pulled out the keys, he muttered something and tossed them to me. Then I told them all to leave and never come back. My mother said that it didn't matter to her anymore, and sarcastically added, "Oh no, that means I won't be able to come to your holidays where I've always been put down because Dan was your obvious favorite." My parents were stunned after I said all this, and the 4 police officers were watching them in disapproval. I'll tell you this, if you want to put parents like mine in their place, you need to get them involved with the police because they won't do anything truly stupid in such a situation. My mother just started crying and left. My father stood silently, staring at me, as if he wanted to hit me, and Dan just held his kids, clearly resigned to defeat. During this time, my sister-in-law was throwing a tantrum on my lawn. Soon, they all stood in line, passing boxes, and quickly taking their things out of my house. It wasn't long before everything was packed up and gone, but in the process, my mother kept saying, "It's not too late, and you can still do this for Dan," repeating her broken record again and again, trying to negotiate with me, hoping to change my mind. She suggested that Dan pay me rent if I allowed them to stay. When that didn't work, she suggested I move back in with them and let Dan rent my house so we wouldn't have to live together. I told her to shut up and keep packing boxes because I didn't want Dan or his family living in my house, and I didn't want his money. I definitely didn't want to live with my parents again after the way they treated me when I was a child. Making a deal with my parents would have been like making a deal with the devil. My sister-in-law threw another tantrum when she heard this, dropped a box, and then sat on the ground, sobbing because she didn't want to return to my parents' house. She just sat there, angry and sad, while the others finished. She didn't even want to get up when it was time to leave. Finally, they took all their things out of the house and loaded them into the truck. And just before they left, I decided to tell my parents one last time everything they had put me through during my childhood. With the 4 officers watching, they couldn't do anything except stand and listen to me. For the first time in my life, I reminded them of everything. I even pointed out that they never did anything good for me, like not letting me stay with them with my camper when I was homeless and trying to get back on my feet. How they let Dan and his wife mock me and call me a drifter. But now, who's the drifter? They wanted to kick me out of my own house so Dan could live in it for free. But when I had nowhere to live, they were ready to squeeze the last bit of skin from me just to park my camper there, even though they knew I had lost my job. The police looked at them disapprovingly when I said all this, so I put my parents in their place again and asked, "What, for the love of God, makes you think you're such good parents?" After all of this, my father turned red, but this time more from embarrassment than anger. My mother cried, saying she was a terrible person. I agreed, saying she really was a terrible person. They were all terrible people, and they knew it. But if I had dumped all these accusations on them without witnesses, they would have just gotten mad and continued thinking I was wrong. They had been in denial for so long that it became part of their personality. My mother hid her face on my father's shoulder to cry, and my father looked defeated. Dan and his family avoided me while they finished loading their things into the truck. I made sure nothing of mine had been stolen, not that I had much furniture at that time. I was lucky I even had a sofa. They all got back in their cars, and my sister-in-law kept glaring at me with hatred. Dan finally made her leave in the minivan, and once everyone left, I went back online to write about what happened. My parents were too embarrassed to try justifying their actions this time, and even though the family was somewhat divided before this incident, the balance had clearly shifted in my favor. Almost all the relatives stood by me after this event, and those who didn't support me just stayed neutral. No matter how much my parents repeated that we did this for Dan, no one was listening anymore. Many of the relatives I didn't expect support from stood by me, including former supporters of my parents. I even offered to host half of the relatives for Christmas in my new home. I didn't invite my parents. To my surprise, my brother and sister-in-law didn't block me on their social media. Thanks to this, I found out that in early November, my sister-in-law gave birth to their 4th child. They still live with my parents. I'm almost certain they knew I was watching their pages because my sister-in-law kept posting passive-aggressive updates every couple of weeks about how they didn't have enough space at my parents' house, probably trying to guilt-trip me. I'm sure this drives my mother and father crazy because they can't find peace in their later years with 3 noisy, annoying kids, a mentally unstable sister-in-law, and a newborn in the house at the same time. Maybe they should move into the camper in their backyard and let Dan take over their house. Maybe then they'd have some peace. Yes, they could do that for Dan. Part 3. My parents, brother, and sister-in-law showed up at my house for Christmas, even though they knew they weren't invited. For those who said I need to install cameras, I plan to do that as soon as I can afford it. I'm still financially recovering after buying the house last year, and as far as I know, good cameras require a decent computer to record the video. I only have a 3-year-old laptop with Windows 10. Yes, I know about the doorbell cameras, and that will be the first thing I buy. For those who continue saying I should have just arrested my brother and sister-in-law, the only reason I didn't do that is because they are family. They need to be there for their kids. If Dan were arrested, he'd probably lose his job, and without a job, his family would be left without money. Plus, my sister-in-law has a newborn. None of them should end up in prison. But for revenge, prison wasn't necessary. The police could have helped, but I got my revenge by not filing a report. Would I show the same mercy again? Probably not, and they know it. My sister-in-law made passive-aggressive posts on her social media page, clearly directed at me, especially after her 4th child was born in November. She kept repeating the same nonsense over and over but with different words. Mostly, she complained about being tired of living with my parents, how there wasn't enough space, how she needed her own house, and so on. I already mentioned that I invited half of the relatives to my Christmas Eve party. Everyone I invited came, despite the 3 to 4 hour drive. These people wanted to come and show their support for me. They praised me for how hard I worked to buy the house on my own, without any help, and regretted everything I had been through. They asked me why I didn't just go live with them instead of being almost homeless for so long. I had to awkwardly admit that I was very attached to living in this neighborhood, and I had the best job opportunities here. Also, I wanted to succeed on my own. This explanation was generally accepted. We continued the party, which turned out to be the best in years. We listened to Christmas songs, had a lot of fun, and I was truly happy. For the first time, I felt like I could forget about my past problems and just enjoy the moment. But I wouldn't be writing here if that were the case. About 2 hours into the party, unexpected guests arrived, my parents, brother, and sister-in-law, with happy smiles on their faces. They didn't even knock, they just walked in like it was their home. I turned off the music and told them to leave immediately. They begged me to let them stay, saying they had brought gifts. My uncle stood up and yelled at them before I could say anything. He told them they didn't deserve to be in my house or my life after what they had tried to do a few months ago. He was supported by a few other relatives. Note that this man is my mother's brother, and he used to adore her until he found out about all the disgusting things that happened between me and my parents. My grandmother and grandfather, my mother's parents, despite their age, rushed to stand between us and told my parents that if they wanted to reconcile with me, now was not the time. They had never been more disappointed in them than they were this year. They needed to start treating me like a son if they ever wanted to be part of my life again. Then they turned to Dan and my sister-in-law and told them they had seen the repetitive posts my sister-in-law kept posting. They were tired of it and told her to just let it go. My house wasn't going to be their new home. My sister-in-law started crying again and put on a pitiful show, claiming that she should live here, not me. She collapsed onto a chair and had a meltdown, saying it was unfair that I had a house while I didn't have my own family. She had 4 kids, and they needed more space. All she wanted was better living conditions for her children to feel like a real mom. It was petty on my part, but I loudly said she was a terrible mother because it was mostly my mother who took care of her children while she spent all day drinking, playing on her phone, or spending Dan's money. And then she dares to complain. I even joked that it's surprising her child isn't getting drunk on breast milk, considering how much she drinks. I admit it went too far because everyone in the room stared at me in surprise, and my sister-in-law demanded I tell her if I thought she was a bad mother. I told her the facts speak for themselves. If she wanted to ever move out of my parents' house, she needed to use her college degree to find a job and learn to manage money. My mother already does most of the work in taking care of my brother's kids, so she would have plenty of time once her youngest child gets a little older. My brother's oldest son, who was 7, ran up to me, started kicking me, and yelled at me for scolding his mom. He screamed that his mom had said I was a bad person for not letting them live here. My brother grabbed his son to pull him away from me, but the rest of the relatives intervened and stood against my sister-in-law and brother. She was crying, her newborn was crying, and her other kids were crying. Hell, even Dan was almost in tears because of the verbal barrage he was receiving. Eventually, he just sat on the entryway bench where I keep my shoes, looking completely defeated. He couldn't look at anyone, couldn't even say 2 words. He was broken. If we had been alone, I'm willing to bet he would have tried to order me to give him my house again, like he did a few months ago, but now he was humiliated, and his reputation in the family was completely shattered. Soon after that, my parents, brother, and sister-in-law left, feeling utterly defeated. The party continued, and we tried not to mention what had just happened for the rest of the evening. Most of the adults drank, and the rest stayed over at my place. I even let some of the guests sleep in the camper so everyone would have enough space. I admit, it turned out to be a great guest house. My relatives couldn't believe I had lived in it for almost 2 years. I woke up before everyone on Christmas morning, made coffee, and prepared ibuprofen for those suffering from a hangover. I was praised for being a much better host than my parents, and we all agreed to meet again next Christmas. After Christmas, my sister-in-law finally stopped posting passive-aggressive updates directed at me and deleted all her old posts. But soon after New Year's, she wrote again, complaining that she had tried to convince my parents to buy her a camper like mine to put in the backyard, so Dan and his family could use the whole house as their own. My parents rejected this idea with great indignation, as I heard. The post was up for only a couple of days before my sister-in-law deleted it, and since then, she's posted almost nothing. It seems she realized there's no point in complaining if no one is listening. Dan can't afford to move out of my parents' house on his salary anytime soon, and if they have another child in the next few years, I won't be surprised. Since then, things have quieted down. Since that Christmas, my parents, brother, and sister-in-law have been keeping their distance from me. They've started acting like I don't exist again, just like before I bought the house. But it doesn't bother me at all. It's actually better this way, but I know they'll eventually find a way to return to my life. I'm curious what ridiculous thing they'll do next. Part 4. My parents and Dan returned to my life sooner than I expected. And this time, they needed money. This probably won't surprise those who commented on my previous posts because my parents did exactly what many predicted. They either wanted my money or my signature. I was expecting the usual narcissistic phrases about how I owe them something or some socialist slogans about sharing wealth. But those were just my imagined fears. It all started when my parents recently contacted me through social media and asked to meet in a public place of my choice. I immediately thought that something was off, but I wasn't afraid. In fact, it amused me. My parents know that they can't joke with me anymore, so I was curious to see what they wanted this time. I chose a local restaurant, and we met there. Dan was with them, but he was mostly silent. After awkward greetings and ordering drinks, we got to the point. My parents begged me to help Dan rent an apartment so he could finally move out of their house. It turns out that Dan doesn't have a good credit history. How surprising, right? Maybe it's because his wife regularly wastes his money. He asked me to either help him financially or act as a guarantor on the lease and help pay the rent. I flat out refused both options. Then Dan, angry, shouted that he needed my help and that I should sacrifice money for his family since I didn't have my own. I laughed and asked where they were when I needed their help. Oh, right, they laughed at me when I was homeless. Or should I remind them of our childhood? I would have been happy to dive into this topic with many listeners around. My mother grabbed my hand and begged me not to talk about it. My father and Dan just turned away and didn't say anything. I asked them if they thought I was some kind of rich person. Their faces said everything when I told them I didn't have that much money. I explained how I managed to save up for the down payment on the house and how I literally had to live at work to save that amount. I'm still in a financial crisis. Yes, I have some free funds each month, but most of it goes into savings. I asked Dan what his annual income was, and when he answered, I pointed out that it was actually a little higher than mine. Then I briefly explained to my parents that about 70% of my income goes to the mortgage, insurance, gas, internet, phone, food, and other bills, leaving me with a maximum of 30% that I can save. I need to have savings for unforeseen circumstances. My pickup truck is from 2000, and if it breaks down, I'll need money for repairs or to buy a new car. There are other things that need an emergency fund, like home repairs, doctors, taxes, lawyers, or any other sudden expenses. So, as you can see, I just can't set aside money for Dan. And I also refuse to act as a guarantor because, in that case, I would be responsible for any bills that Dan can't or won't pay. Then I pointed out that's probably why my parents didn't act as guarantors for Dan. My mother started crying again. I was one step ahead in everything. I'm not an ATM, and I'm not an idiot, and I said that straight to their faces. I expected my father to get angry with me, as he always did, but this time he didn't. I've known this man my whole life, and he would blow up at me for the slightest provocation if I didn't agree with my brother, but not this time. There was no trace of a smirk on his face. The only way to describe his expression was regret and defeat. Maybe regret for being a terrible parent, or maybe regret because he could no longer intimidate me. Who knows? Either way, my parents had no arguments to argue with me, and I wasn't going to give them money. Dan just stood up and said that this was a waste of time and that he was leaving. My mother started apologizing for him, but Dan still wanted to leave. Then, to kill them with kindness, I offered to treat them to food. Since we were all here, I think they couldn't refuse a free meal and stayed. I did everything I could to avoid talking about money. Dan either stayed silent, ate, or stared at his phone, and my parents awkwardly tried to talk to me. They mentioned that they had recently joined a local Christian church and that they had been going there for the last 2 weeks. I said, good for you, and of course, they tried to suggest I should go too. I simply said, no, thanks, and they were smart enough not to insist. When everyone finished eating, Dan left $10 on the table for a tip and left without saying a word. My mother simply apologized for him, and we all parted ways. That's it. It wasn't as dramatic as I thought. As for my sister-in-law, she still regularly complains about my parents on the internet. It seems she really dislikes the fact that she's not the one in charge in their house, and I think her toxicity has finally started to affect my parents. My sister-in-law even wants my parents to move into a camper like I had to free up space in the house for her, and every time, they refuse. However, it seems she has her own fan club because, from time to time, an unknown person texts me, angrily blaming me for not giving my house to my sister-in-law. I don't argue with these people anymore. I just block them and move on. Although there was one persistent troll who found my phone number. He calls me from different numbers every time. Yes, it seems like it's the same person who called me earlier to say I should make room for the real family man, Dan, but I don't care. However, it seems that the calls have become less and less frequent, if not stopped altogether. The last time I got a call, and since then, silence. Part 5. Parents and brother are back in action. Yes, things have started to go bad again, but mostly not for me. Overall, I'm doing fine since last Christmas, except for the time when my parents and Dan asked for money and the recent altercation with my sister-in-law, which you'll read about now. I've installed several cameras in my house, including a doorbell camera. I haven't mentioned the cameras to my family, just in case, but so far, no one has tried to break into my house. I've rented out 2 rooms in my house, one to a close friend and the other to a friend of that friend. Both turned out to be great guys and good neighbors. They are quiet, don't disturb me most of the time, and even set up little fridges in their rooms to keep their drinks separate from the main fridge. I offered them such a good rental deal that they couldn't refuse. This has significantly increased my monthly income, and even after taxes, I continue to save decent amounts in my bank account every month, as the rental income covers a large portion of my mortgage. You might be curious how my parents, brother, and sister-in-law reacted to the news that I was renting rooms to friends. The answer is, badly. My father and Dan said nothing, but my sister-in-law made a huge scene. My mother came to me, crying, complaining that I could have rented the rooms to Dan and his family. We argued a bit, and I pointed out that they damn well changed the locks in my house to move in without permission. She definitely wouldn't have wanted people who did something like that living with her. Besides, my house is too small for me, Dan, and his entire family. Even if I ever agreed to live with them under one roof, I have a house with 3 bedrooms. I live in the master bedroom with a private bathroom, so there would only be 2 small rooms left for Dan, his wife, and their 4 kids. Not to mention that they would constantly irritate me. My mother knows very well that I can't stand being around my sister-in-law because she constantly provokes me, and they all mocked me when I was homeless. In addition, my current tenants are 2 bachelors in their 30s, with whom I get along well. My mother cried for a while, but in the end, she admitted she was just desperate. And you know how my parents found out I was renting rooms? My sister-in-law somehow followed me, then told my parents about it, and my mother came to me crying. Since then, my parents have stopped bothering me about the house. So, everything's good on my end. As for my parents and Dan, not so much. It turns out my sister-in-law is an even worse person than I thought. I already knew she was a master manipulator and a drama queen, but she sunk even lower in my eyes. The younger child Dan thought was his isn't actually his. Yes, you heard that right. My sister-in-law cheated on him, which, in hindsight, isn't that surprising, and it's something many of us predicted months ago. After she was caught red-handed, my sister-in-law was kicked out of the family. Dan recently finalized the divorce, and fortunately, in our state, divorces are granted based on fault, so Dan won the case. He also filed a lawsuit to have his name removed from the birth certificate of the youngest child, and he won. So, after that incident, when my parents tried to force me to give my house to Dan, things went completely downhill in their house. My sister-in-law somehow blamed me for everything. She was sure I had a lot of money, as if I had won the lottery or received an inheritance, and that I should share my wealth. According to her, she convinced my parents and husband to come to my Christmas party because she didn't expect them to win me over. And this was entirely her idea, to ask me for money for the rent. So, her hopes were shattered when Dan and my parents informed her about my real financial situation. I think the fact that my relatives scolded them at my Christmas party not only further destroyed my parents' reputation but also served as a wake-up call for them to stop listening to my sister-in-law. And as I mentioned in the last post, my parents decided to start going to church again, probably because last year I told them they were likely going to hell for their actions. I can't say that's the real reason, but it felt good to think that way. Although my parents hadn't gone to church for the past 2 decades, they came to my house without Dan to apologize after reading the first 3 parts of my story. Yes, they found them. They also know everything I've written here, and they are very unhappy about it. For my parents and Dan, reading the story about them was a great way to realize what kind of people they really were. I've never seen my father apologize like this to anyone, and this man is far from being a good actor, so it seemed sincere. My parents fully acknowledged what they had done to me and admitted that there was no excuse for it. They even described themselves as narcissists and admitted the truth about how much they had hurt me. Then they started blaming my sister-in-law for many things. Yes, they kind of pinned everything on her, but you can't say she's the only one to blame for everything. My parents had been seeing a therapist for some time, and they suggested I join them for family therapy. I declined because I'm not ready for that emotionally. Dan didn't apologize to me, but every time the topic of the past came up, he looked extremely regretful. Meanwhile, Dan's marriage to my sister-in-law completely fell apart. This woman finally showed her true face to Dan and my parents, and they realized she wasn't who she appeared to be. But as you can guess, everything only got worse because my sister-in-law kept looking for other ways to get what she wanted. She continued showing ads for used RVs to try to convince my parents to buy one so Dan and his family could use the whole house as their own. My parents refused this idea with great indignation, as I heard. The post was up for only a couple of days before my sister-in-law deleted it, and since then, she's posted almost nothing. It seems she realized there's no point in complaining if no one is listening. Dan can't afford to move out of my parents' house on his salary anytime soon, and if they have another child in the next few years, I won't be surprised. Since then, things have quieted down. Since that Christmas, my parents, brother, and sister-in-law have been keeping their distance from me. They've started acting like I don't exist again, just like before I bought the house. But it doesn't bother me at all. It's actually better this way, but I know they'll eventually find a way to return to my life. I'm curious what ridiculous thing they'll do next. Part 6. How Dan found out the truth about his wife. Most of this information came from Dan and my parents. Let me just summarize when, in March, Dan suddenly accused his wife of cheating. This shocked us all because we thought he was completely under her thumb. But it turned out that wasn't the case. You all know how he treated me when I went against him. Well, his wife didn't fare any better. He started piecing together the puzzle of her betrayal after finally getting his head out of the sand and secretly conducting DNA tests for all his children. 3 of the kids turned out to be his, but the youngest one wasn't. For reference, both Dan and I have almost black straight hair, like our parents, and my sister-in-law also has straight, dark hair, but the baby's hair was light and slightly curly. At first, Dan thought it would darken with age, but the baby's hair never did. I think that was the biggest red flag for Dan. He presented the DNA test results to his wife in front of our parents. She burst into tears, claiming it was a lab error. She used all the classic tactics: denial, gradual admission of the truth, and manipulation, but Dan wasn't buying it. He went much further to uncover the truth about her affair than I ever thought he would. I knew he was smart, he just allowed himself to be foolish for too long. He had detailed evidence of her infidelity, recorded phone calls, messages he read on her phone, bank statements, and the DNA test. He even identified the identity of her lover, who was most likely the father of the child because he had light, curly hair. The evidence against her was rock solid, and Dan said she was so bad at hiding her affair that it didn't take much for him to figure it all out. My parents demanded that my sister-in-law leave their house immediately. She flipped out. At first, she just screamed, but soon she became aggressive. My mother had to call the police. Yes, my sister-in-law was arrested. She scratched Dan and my father with her long fake nails, and even her older son got caught in the crossfire when he tried to intervene. Dan was smart enough to record everything on his phone, so the police had all the evidence needed to arrest her for assault. My sister-in-law's parents had to come to bail her out. Then, a few days after my sister-in-law was released from jail, she showed up on my doorstep, probably because I was next on her list. As soon as I opened the door, she started a rambling tirade accusing me of posting everything online. Then she claimed I was her worst enemy. I'm not sure, but I think she might have been on something because she seemed even crazier than usual, and her eyes looked unnatural. She insisted that mothers with small children are the most sacred beings in the world, then started yelling that giving up my house wasn't a big deal because supporting family was the least I could do. If I did this, her family would be together. When I tried to argue while she was shouting all this, she tried to push me and shut me up with her hand. She even raised her hand as if she was ready to scratch me. Well, as you can guess, things didn't go in her favor. I'm not the kind of person who lets themselves be intimidated. I told her I'd call the police if she didn't immediately remove her hands from me. I also told her everything was being recorded on the doorbell camera. She started panicking as soon as she heard the word camera. Then I verbally humiliated her so much that she started backing away. I told her she had the audacity to call me selfish when she was the one who didn't work, cheated on her husband, got pregnant by her lover, made my mother raise her kids, and spent Dan's money until they were in financial ruin. And she behaved as if my house belonged to her. I called her a narcissistic, level 100 selfish person and told her to stop blaming me for her own actions and never show up at my house again. Those words were the last straw for her. She jumped into her car, slammed the gas pedal, and drove off. This became the final straw for me. Now that she had separated from Dan, I finally went to the police and filed a report against her for harassment and assault she committed on me last year, as well as her recent actions on my doorstep. I also gave Dan copies of the video for his divorce lawyer. Yes, I filed for a restraining order against her. It was easily granted because it was obvious this woman wasn't mentally stable. Since then, she hasn't posted anything about me, at least I haven't seen any. In any case, she left me alone. My sister-in-law is still in a relationship with her lover during the divorce process. At the time, I didn't know who he was, but anyone who's having an affair with a married woman and even fathering her child probably doesn't have any moral principles. When the divorce started, my sister-in-law admitted that Dan was no longer a real man to her because he couldn't provide the level of life she wanted. She really thought of herself as a trophy wife and believed she deserved to be with someone rich. Dan said that he laughed maniacally in her face and told her she wasn't even close to being beautiful enough to be a trophy wife and pointed out her other flaws. My sister-in-law was once again humiliated because she had to live with her parents. She was forced to work in their family business because Dan no longer gave her access to his bank accounts. This woman had maxed out all the credit cards he gave her. She complained that she had to work for her parents, but I think they were the only ones who would hire her since she has a criminal record and a decade-long career gap. I heard from Dan that her parents were severely disappointed in her. In any case, this terrible divorce really stirred the pot. My sister-in-law didn't get much from Dan because she cheated on him, physically hurt his father, and his older child. The divorce was her fault, as I mentioned before. So, she said goodbye to any chances of getting what she wanted. I'll tell you more about this in the next part. Part 7. What I know about my brother Dan's divorce. Dan's lawyer tried to speed up the divorce process, but it cost my brother dearly. I don't know exactly how much it all cost him, but my sister-in-law, on the other hand, found herself in a very difficult financial situation. And we all know what happens when you back an animal into a corner. She started resisting, but the law wasn't on her side, nor were her finances, which were dwindling by the day. My sister-in-law's parents had to pay for her lawyer's fees, but he wasn't the best one. Moreover, she brought her lover to the courtroom to defend her. He had a silver tongue and a charming smile, and he tried to use that to his advantage. He claimed that my sister-in-law suffered from an incompetent husband, so she sought comfort in the arms of another man. He also said that he was willing to take responsibility for the child he fathered with her. The guy even claimed that my sister-in-law would need alimony to support herself and care for the child. He pointed out that since Dan's name was still on the birth certificate at the time, alimony should be his responsibility. Dan said he maniacally laughed in the guy's face, telling him that he wasn't even close to being good-looking enough to be a trophy husband, and pointed out other flaws about him. The judge also didn't buy it and called him a hypocrite for claiming he was willing to take responsibility for the child but then asking for money from the person whose marriage he had destroyed. Dan was ready to file a lawsuit against his wife's lover for intentionally destroying their marriage. This is something that exists in certain US states, but unfortunately, it didn't work out for him. Apparently, Dan had to prove that she loved him before the affair began. But after we saw her true nature, we weren't sure if she ever loved him or if she just used him as a source of income. Many commenters suggested that my sister-in-law probably had children to avoid working, and maybe they were right. In any case, my sister-in-law tried to drag out the divorce, but Dan's lawyer and the judge didn't let it happen. All the evidence we had against her made her attempts to portray herself as the victim useless. So, she finally revealed her true self. As I said before, it was a good thing the truth came out. Dan took on all the debts from the credit cards my sister-in-law had maxed out. He also got his name removed from the birth certificate of the youngest child he was no longer responsible for. My sister-in-law agreed to partial custody of the children, but no alimony. She also had to deal with the bulk of the debt she had accumulated. Her official employment with her parents meant she had her own income to start paying off the debts. She can see the kids almost any time and even take them for weekends. But for some reason, she rarely tries to see them. She's taken them out for fast food a few times, but never brought them home for a sleepover. You would think her parents would want to see their grandchildren, but they didn't reach out to Dan about it. They rarely visited Dan's kids, and after the divorce, they probably won't see them at all. As for Dan, he really loved his wife, so her betrayal hit him hard, and he started drinking. The night he confronted his wife about the affair, he showed up at my place, stumbling with a bottle of whiskey in his hand, all scratched up. I was scared when I saw him in that condition and started scolding him for drunk driving, but that didn't matter to him compared to the betrayal from his cheating wife. We spent several hours in my camper so we wouldn't disturb my tenants. During that time, Dan drank whiskey straight from the bottle and cried, calling himself a fool and regretting marrying that woman. Almost every time he mentions her now, he just calls her that. It's ironic, but those few hours were the closest I'd been with Dan in the last 15 years. Even though he didn't apologize directly, he called himself a horrible person with terrible taste in women. Then he said that, at least, I didn't make his mistakes. Despite everything he did to me, he's still my younger brother, and I couldn't risk letting him drive home. So I told him to stay the night and took his car keys. I then prepared a sleeping space for him in my camper because all the other rooms were occupied. He wasn't in a condition to drive home, and if he took a taxi, he would have had to pay a lot for the ride and then go back for his car. He was still depressed, crying, and didn't want our parents or his kids to see him in that state. Honestly, I was afraid he would do something insanely stupid if I let him go. About a month after he separated from his wife, Dan came to me and asked if he could borrow my camper. Apparently, it seemed more convenient for him to sleep in it than I thought when he stayed there. He said that after his wife left, he decided to give up his room for his oldest child, who's 8 years old. Until then, the kids were forced to share a room. For the boy, they just hung up curtains to separate his side, but he often slept on the couch to avoid being with his sisters. I know that poor kid really wanted his own room, so I think Dan decided to be a good father and came to me to ask to borrow my camper so his son could get his room. If he could afford it, he would have bought his own camper. In the end, I gave in and let him use it for a good cause. No, I didn't ask for rent for the camper. Dan was already in a tough spot financially after his divorce, and I understood. I realized that I'd made progress in my relationships with family when I don't show bitterness. I brought my camper over and set it up in my parents' backyard. My father installed an automatic 30A breaker so Dan would have enough power for the heater and air conditioning. I miss my camper. After living in it for so many years, it almost became a part of me, but the only reason I lent it out was because of Dan's kids. They're practically the only reason I still do anything for my parents or Dan, because I've grown attached to them. Yes, I know I may not get the camper back in the near future, and probably not in the same condition I lent it out in, but I warned Dan and my parents that they would be financially responsible for any damage caused to the camper and its upkeep during its use. I also took lots of photos and videos of the camper inside and out before I lent it out. Dan even recorded a video with me agreeing to the terms. So, we have a sort of contract. Because of the divorce, Dan will probably not be able to afford his own place for the next few years. Although it seems he's not complaining about his life in general, I don't know if he actually likes this lifestyle or if he's just pretending. I've received a lot of gratitude from all the relatives for letting my brother use the camper. Now many relatives call me the good brother Dan doesn't deserve. In any case, I think getting rid of my sister-in-law was a great first step in restoring our family. I still don't care much for my brother and parents after the way they treated me my whole life, but I won't let Dan's kids suffer because of this. These kids have really grown attached to me. They actually get happy when I visit them or when they come to visit me. I've even spent time with them now that their mother isn't around. They've become a lot kinder, especially to me. I'm finally starting to enjoy my role as an uncle. My father often looks very depressed in my presence, but otherwise, he either stays silent or just behaves normally toward me. He doesn't talk to me much, but our relationship is much better than it used to be. I'm not lowering my guard. My parents are happy that my ex-sister-in-law is gone from their house, and they often say they don't understand what they ever saw in her. Especially my mother, because they had argued for a long time about who was the real head of the house. Along with the divorce, Dan also filed to have his name removed from the birth certificate of the child who wasn't his. Part 8. My ex-sister-in-law saw my posts. She's angry because she can't do anything about it. It's not surprising that my ex-sister-in-law saw my posts. She can't contact me directly about it except through her lawyer, thanks to the restraining order. She probably can't afford to hire a lawyer now because the divorce hit her financially as well. That's why she complained to Dan and demanded that he tell me to delete my accusations from the internet. Dan also read my posts and didn't mind them existing. He said they serve as a reminder of what a jerk he used to be. Moreover, I still helped him despite everything he did to me. My parents are also trying to treat me and Dan equally when I'm around. Although my father still says very little in my presence, someone noted that he just doesn't know how to communicate with me anymore, after all these years of comparing me to Dan. I think that's true, but I'm not bothered by it. My mother also developed a habit of apologizing for every little thing in my presence. Dan told me that she and my father were frequently criticized by relatives and their therapist, and now my mother feels like she needs to apologize for all of it. This is drastically different from how they used to treat me. My ex-sister-in-law found out that Dan took my camper so his son could take over their old bedroom. Like a typical abuser, she started mocking him because now, according to her, he lives like a homeless person. But Dan took it calmly because he knew exactly how she would react. He just doesn't care anymore. To him, she's practically dead, and her insults just roll off him. Then he pointed out to her that he's living in the old camper because he puts his kids first and wants his son to have his own room, while his ex never did that. Even though she's their mother, she just used her kids and her pregnancy to avoid working and emotionally blackmail everyone. This was back at the beginning of their divorce. Dan said his ex caused a huge scene because of my recent posts, but no one bothered to contact me on her behalf to try to get them removed. So, she just had to accept the public humiliation. She's been trying to behave better with Dan lately, probably because living with her parents isn't as fun as she thought. Dan tolerates her when she visits because she's the mother of his kids, but nothing more. He told me he would never take her back. He said he could never look at her the same way again, and just the thought of her disgusts him. So, my ex-sister-in-law has almost no chance of reconciliation. Part 9. My pickup was egged on Halloween. It happened late at night or early in the morning on November 1st. I suspect it was my ex-sister-in-law, but the person who appeared on my cameras was dressed in several layers of thick clothing, wearing large glasses covering their eyes, and the lower half of their face was wrapped in a scarf. It was impossible to tell whether it was a man or a woman. This person also walked to my house, so I couldn't identify their car. They were about the same height as my ex-sister-in-law, but that's not enough to consider it proof. If it was her, she must have known about my cameras, so covering her face and body for a small egging revenge was probably the smartest thing she's done in the past few years, an excellent way to finally put her higher education to practical use. The egg-throwing person appeared around 3 a.m. I was sound asleep and didn't hear anything. They quickly threw eggs at my pickup, at least a dozen. Fortunately, they didn't try to cause serious damage and disappeared as soon as they threw the last egg. I didn't notice it until I went outside to work in the morning. During my lunch break, I took my pickup to the local car wash. Most of the eggs were washed off. Eggs are indeed harmful to the paint, but my pickup is from the 90s and doesn't look brand new anymore. I took photos of the pickup and filed a police report, attaching footage from the cameras as evidence. But so far, it hasn't led to anything. There wasn't any real damage, other than my irritation and the $15 I spent on the car wash. If it was my ex-sister-in-law, she was smart enough to throw eggs instead of scratching the paint or puncturing the tires. I don't think anything will come of the police report since they probably dismissed it as a joke by some kids. I understand that they're likely overwhelmed with real work. But at least I filed the report in case something like this happens again. I waited a bit to write this post because I thought something else might happen, but no, everything has been calm. I'd be happy to hear any good advice on what to do if something like this happens again. What do you think about this whole situation? Please let me know in the comments. Do you think I've gone too far with my revenge, or maybe I'm too sensitive about everything happening? Maybe my revenge wasn't strong enough. I'm looking forward to hearing your opinion. Anyway, thanks for watching this video all the way through. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this in the future. You know how hard it is to make a video this long. Check out our previous video that you'll see on the screen, and good luck!